Thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to speak to you. I've read two of your books. We were talking a little bit before this, one on duality, and another book, which I have with me right here, which is called Lack and Transcendence. And when I read this book, it blew my mind. As I told you before, I really felt like I was, reading my own autobiography about myself. Um, because in my life, I've done a lot of things to fill up my lack. One of them
We
being
all have. Yeah, go ahead.
becoming a professional athlete, and I played in the minor leagues for the New York Yankees and Colorado Rockies, and I also was an opera singer. That was my other thing I went into, and I'm a lawyer, and I, have been going chasing things all the time, and from the time I was childhood, and had a very, success and driven sort of life, and ultimately, it actually led to a lot of suffering.
Mm.
So I when I read the book, I was just like, wow, I've got to talk to David, and what I'd really like to do is just kind of bring your book into the practical world, and I know you talk a lot about Buddhism and things of that nature, but we're going to go into sports and competition and what that's like in the Western world and in the rest of the world actually, and how your book could sort of inform the way we look at competition in sports and accomplishment. So anyway, I guess so to begin, my first question is just as an introduction, if you could explain, um, why is it does do most human beings have this nagging sense of lack? That I need more. I need more money. People talk about they accomplish something and then they get there and it's like they realize, oh, I still don't have enough. So if you could say a little bit on that, I would just love to hear your perspective there.
Sure, sure. Well, first of all, thanks for the plug for those books, especially the Lack book. I'll slip you that money. Uh, but no, thank you. Yeah, I'm excited that you found the book so helpful. And it was interesting for me writing the book. It was kind of the same thing, you know. I was kind of working through what readers work through when they read it because it was a very personal book to write. It's still my favorite, and because it was very revelatory in terms of what was motivating me as well, you know, in lots of different fields. I think it does have a lot of relevance for athletics and the kind of competition we get caught up in. But I think it gives a lot of insight into our preoccupation with making money, you know, you never have enough, or becoming famous, or having a perfect body. I think those are three of the big ways in which I think our sense of lack tends to come out. So the basic idea is that, and this is something that for me it was connected with Buddhism and Buddhist practice. I'm a
Yep.
Zen teacher, a long-term practitioner, and I don't want to spend too much time on the Buddhism, but basically one of the important Buddhist teachings is this strange counterintuitive emphasis that really there's no separate self, that the sense of a separate self is a delusion, or in modern language, it's a construct, a psychological and social construct. And Buddhism emphasizes that there's a lot of uh, suffering, dissatisfaction, problems built into that delusion. And so basically, the way it clicked for me, putting all that together, was to realize that the sense of self that we all have, that, you know, babies aren't born with it, right? It's something that develops. As I said,
Mhm.
it's a construct, but as it develops, the sense of self, it has this other side, this sense of lack. And basically what it comes down to is, because the sense of self being a construct, it doesn't have any sort of reality or substantiality. It's a kind of a function. But because of that, it's inherently insecure. I guess maybe that's the important point to emphasize. Insofar as we feel that we are a sense of separate self, then there's some fundamental insecurity, dissatisfaction built into that. And we usually experience it as a sense of lack, as the sense that something is wrong with me, something isn't quite right, I'm not good enough. And it's so interesting to kind of go around talking about this because we tend to think that it's our own individual problem. But once you actually get out there and talk to people, guess what? It's like everybody has this sense of lack that comes out in one way or the other. And so it's fun to watch people kind of nodding away as I start to talk about this. But the other thing to emphasize, I think, is, here in the US, as people have pointed out, we're probably the most individualistic culture in human history,
Hmm.
which is to say that we have a stronger sense of separate self. And I think what that means is we also have a stronger sense of lack than in a lot of other cultures where they have more of a group society, extended family, lots of friends. I think that sort of, because there's that sense of belonging and identification with something greater than our own selves, our own egos, that gives them a kind of a grounding that we tend to lack. And therefore, I think our sense of lack in the US is greater than most other
Yeah.
places.
I mean, I would say like the sort of ambition that is in the US that is taken for granted, right? Like that's seen as a good thing, right? That's held up as, oh, this is the way you should behave, the people we admire, right? It's like it's like that's a reaction to something, and we're looking at the reaction, but we're not looking at what's the other side of that, right? And the other side of that is, well, I've got to become this because I'm afraid that I'm really not anything at all, right? And I
Yeah,
don't want to look there. And
yeah,
so we tend to distract ourselves, and as you say in the book, right, with we want to be real, we want to feel real. And because we're really, as you said, a construct and we're not really real, right? The sometimes that motivating factor, like, oh, I'm going to become the top of this or whatever, is actually a reaction or a projection, right, out into the world of a sort of an unacknowledged or unconscious uh knowledge that actually what I am is not this self, this person at all, really. And that kind of leads me actually into my second question, is that especially in my generation,
mm,
there's this sort of attitude of like YOLO, you only live once, because I'm going to die, I've got to get the most out of life. I've got to achieve my potential. I've got to, keep up with the latest trends. I've got to have the best house. I've got to go to all the right parties. I'm afraid to miss out on this. I'm afraid to miss out on that. And it's taken for granted. I want to travel the world. I want to see every country. You know, what's really, what's really going on there, and how could your book sort of frame that in a little bit of a different manner?
well, it's not only YOLO, it's a FOMO, right?
Right.
Fear of missing out. And at some level, um, because we have this sense of lack, this sense of inadequacy, um, there's I think that feeds very much the sense of competition. And we're living in a society where we're exposed to all of these kinds of images of other people supposedly who are much happier than we are. They own a lot more stuff, they travel more, they have more sex, better sex, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's the sense that out there is this really full uh, life that people are having, and yet inside each of us has this kind of unconscious festering sense that my life isn't that way. And so I think
Right.
it's an attempt to sort of live the life that we think other people are living. And I think it also, we're affected by technology, the fact that we're surrounded by screens and spend so much time looking at screens like we're doing right
Right now.
now. And the screens expose us to all of this. They make it more alive. It's not like the old days when you would be living in a little town and that's kind of where you would get all of your ideas and your ambitions. But it seems like the world is much more our oyster, and so we feel that we've got to be inspired by what everyone else is doing and have that kind of life as well. But but I see that as a classic example of what I call in the book lack projects, you
Hmm.
know, that out of this sort of misunderstood sense of insecurity, this inherently insecure self, um, we're always grasping at something that we think something out here that's going to fill up our sense of lack. And the fundamental problem is that because all of those things, whether it's money, fame, or you know, a bucket list, whatever, because those things are just symptoms of the fundamental problem. It doesn't matter, you know, how many international trips you take. Doesn't matter how rich or famous you become. It's never going to assuage that kind of festering sense of lack at our core.
Yeah, it's like at the end of the day, no matter what you do, it's like you're still gonna die in a kind of a way, and everyone knows that. And so like, yeah, it's like you know what a strange loop is, how you kind of like you're gonna go up the stairs and you actually keep going, you end up at the same place.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's sort of like, you know, it's sort of like one of those strange loops. Like you think you're going up the stairs and you've gone up, but actually when you get up to the top, you actually realize you're actually in the same spot. You've looped around to the bottom. So it's
Like an
sort of
Escher
like that.
print, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're never, yeah, right. You're never really going anywhere. And so it's this unending hole. And the point you make in the book, which I love again, which I'll keep emphasizing, is like the whole, it's the structure of the self itself that that is the that is what coterminous or coexistent, or actually the same thing
Two
as
sides of the same thing.
two
Yeah.
sides of the same coin with these
Right.
problems. So
Yeah.
anyway, now I'd like to get into sports and bring my own life into it, you know. And I kind of wanted to read a book, you know, because I grew up in a very, by the time I was 5 years old, you know, I had it implanted into my head that I'm going to be a Major League Baseball player. You know, and I was looking up to all these professional athletes like they were
Right.
gods. You know, when we grow up, oh, the Yankees and this guy, and I want to be like them, and I want to be good. And I remember this, you know, as a little kid, and even, you know, my dad, he was well intentioned, and I've spoken about this with him before, but when I was 8 years old, I was a very good 8-year-old baseball player. And he put me on a 12-year-old team. Let's
Mm.
play up. And I
Right.
remember how much pressure that put on me as a little kid. And this sort of drive to competition. And I kind of wanted to read one quick quote from your book. And that is kind of about competition. And you said, you know, the ego cannot absolve its own lack because the ego is the other side of that lack. In terms of life and death, the ego is that which believes itself to be alive and fears death. Hence, the ego, although only a mental construction, will face its imminent disappearance with horror.
Mm.
Our struggle against death is usually redirected into symbolic games of competition as the urge to defeat our opponent, or at least be a little better than our neighbor. This was like, wow, you know, because me growing up trying to be a professional athlete and competing, when you said our struggle against death is usually redirected into symbolic games of competition. And, you know, we're in the United States, we're obsessed with these NFL, Major League Baseball, NBA games. Why?
Well, I like the way you put it. We are obsessed, and I think it's important to bring your dad into it here. It's
Let's
like
do it.
this is how you internalized what I would call a kind of a lack project to become a certain kind of person. But as I'm sure you've sorted out in your head, this was you were your dad's lack project, right?
Yes.
And that's an important thing for a lot of us to remember. For a lot of people, you know, they get married, they have kids, and one of the main ways the sense of lack comes out is wanting the kids to be a certain way, wanting to live through, find their own success through the success of the kids. So there's a kind of a fundamental shift. It just goes down, I think, to the next generation. Um, I I
For
think it's
sure.
important to point that out. And
Yes.
wanting to emphasize that, I somehow forgot the main forgot the main point here.
Oh no, I was just about the part of when we said, our struggle against death is usually redirected into our symbolic games of competition. And it
Right,
was kind of like we're obsessed with Major League Baseball, the NFL,
right,
um, basketball. We're obsessed with this stuff, and even in high school or schools, competition, being the other
right,
person, being the best.
right, right,
Even in the law, I'm a lawyer as a law firm. Like this is how our society functions, and especially in sports. And it's gone back to Roman times. The breads and circuses of that time is the NFL Super Bowl of
right,
today. So
right,
I guess my question to you is why?
right,
Why? What are
right.
people not looking at here?
Right. Well, there's a couple things going on there. It's interesting that you read that passage that talked about death, because really that's the way many of us sort of, I think, sublimate our sense of lack, that we become preoccupied with death and we kind of repress that, some people would say. And so, in a way, you not only can talk about lack projects, but also just these are our ways of sort of trying to immortalize ourselves, especially in the sports world. You think of the great people, right? Like Michael Jackson will be famous. His videos, his greatest plays. Sorry, Michael Jordan,
Yeah,
not
Michael
Michael
Jordan. Yeah,
Jackson.
well, Michael Jackson, same thing.
Yeah, but yeah, a different version there. Yeah, with the entertainment. So how uh, there's that aspect to it, but I think there's another aspect to it in the sense of where do we find the meaning of our lives? Because built into this concept of a lack project is how does that solve this big question of what is the meaning of my life? What am I going to do with my life? What's important in my life? And of course, being social creatures, given that, as I said earlier, that our sense of self is this kind of not only psychological but social construct, we tend to learn what's important, uh, what we should value, what we should seek, by observing what other people are doing. And of course, in our culture, given the possibility of sports and the way the media work, I think this has become a really major aspect, for a lot of people. Their identification with a sports star or a sports team is a major factor in terms of the meaning of their own lives. The success or the failure of that team reflects very immediately on ourselves. So in many situations, when people are struggling to survive, say economically or even physically, or during a wartime situation when you are fighting against an opponent and you're trying to defeat and kill each other, then the meaning gets, those are pretty meaningful situations, right?
Right.
It's got to draw the best out of you. But you know, I think one aspect or something that really affects us is, okay, well, we're not in a world war. We're, a lot of us are middle class, at least to the extent that we don't have to worry about where our next meal is coming from. And the media naturally imposes this on us, just like they impose everything else in that consumerism, uh, which requires advertising. And likewise, there's a lot of money to be made off professional sports. And so there's
Mhm.
a kind of conditioning that encourages us to identify with stars and teams, as I was saying earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think that also goes to your point in the book of transference, right? You talked about basically the psychological concept of, basically transferring you've got a sense of lack, and so you attach to an idol or something like that to give you meaning, and that move actually prevents you from looking at yourself or looking or seeing your own sense of lack and sort of project it out there into the world. And I grew up doing that, idolizing athletes, and a lot of people do, and a lot of people turn a lot of different things into idols. It's kind of like people think we're not religious anymore, in the sense that maybe we're not doing that with a God, but it's like we've maybe eliminated God, but we're replacing that with idolizing a top athlete like Tom Brady, or idolizing a top businessman like Mark Cuban, or even the show like Shark Tank on TV, where they bring in entrepreneurs and they promote these go-getting entrepreneurs, and oh, I can be like them, like this whole sort of thing of here's this ideal, go be like this other person, right? And
Right.
you mentioned also legacy as well, and that was kind of a previous question, but it all kind of ties in to the same point, basically.
I think so. And I just want to emphasize what your point implied, but just to be explicit, it's not just that we idolize certain people, but that in the idolizing, they become models of who we want to become, right?
Right.
It's like they answer that question, like, we grow up, well, so many possibilities. What are we going to focus on? And the reality is we're going to need something. So almost everyone is going to idolize someone or something. Um, and I think to some degree that's maybe necessary, and I don't even know if it's necessarily bad,
Hmm.
insofar as it can promote us to develop ourselves in certain ways.
Right.
Uh, the example that I would I mentioned that I've uh, am a Zen student
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
now a teacher sometimes. But I remember when I first saw my Japanese Zen master, my first retreat with him, I remember there was just some sense of transference that went on. I was so impressed by his bearing, by how he carried himself, by what he said. And I remember thinking, in effect, if Zen practice can make me someone like that, then uh, then that's what I'm interested
Hmm.
in. And so that motivated me to practice in a certain way, something I certainly would never regret. At a certain point, I think it's important for us to break our transferences in
Yeah.
the sense of um, withdraw that kind of projected psychic energy and find what we're looking for in ourselves. And of course, ironically, I mean, with my example in Zen or a lot of meditation practices, that is the ultimate goal, to realize our own Buddha nature.
Right.
So the idolization may serve a function, but it's the nature of transference that, in one sense, it doesn't really work
Yeah.
insofar as we're hoping to become that person. So, we can get a lot out of it, but ultimately we have to see through it.
Yeah. It kind of brings me, it's such a great point. It brings me to my next question about becoming and time. And you have got this whole great chapter in the book about time, and
Hmm.
how time reifies the sense of self, because you need a sense of time, or a person. I will become this, or I will do this. It's part of how we integrate our stories, and and actually kind of escape of what the truth is now,
Right here and now.
right
Yeah.
here and now.
Yeah.
And what I found most interesting about that is this, I took a lot of that for granted in my life, about this, oh, I'm going to become something, like just becoming conscious of, oh, I'm doing that, and even like the transference thing. And when you said it might not be a bad thing, it's like, not necessarily that it's a bad thing, but in my life, it was unconscious. It was the ability for me to recognize, oh, I'm doing that. And this is a choice, and I don't have to, right? It was
By
becoming
making it
conscious,
conscious, it becomes a choice. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It becomes conscious, and I know, okay, that's what it's making up for. It's like by becoming conscious of it, we talked about how it's two sides of the same coin, the lack and the ego, right? It's sort of like when you become conscious of the transference, or the sense of becoming, what happens is also, as you become conscious of the other side of the coin that it was hiding, which is your own sense of, oh, lack, and maybe the deep sadness, or something that's actually at the bottom, really, of myself, that I don't want to look at. And the reason why I want to bring up becoming is because, I can tell you this myself, that when I dropped into, I don't know when this would come over me, but I would play freely, and it would be just a sense of being in the zone, as the athletes say. And every
Mm.
athlete wants to be in the zone, but even the best ones, they don't really know how it comes on them. I was just in the zone and then it went away and I don't know how to get it
Because they
back.
forgot themselves. Yeah.
Right. And so
Yeah.
this whole struggle of I'm in the zone, I kind of wanted you, I'll leave it to you, address that becoming, time, and being in the zone as a sports person.
Well, not only for sports people, but that's definitely one application of it. Yeah. I
Right.
mean, this emphasis on time, I think, is really important because, insofar as we're motivated by these lack projects, whether it's sports or something else, there's a certain way of experiencing time that our culture encourages, a certain future perspective, right? It's like future oriented in a way that creates problems because we tend to sort of devalue the present moment into simply a means to something that will be much better in the future, right? So
Hmm.
right now is the means, the future is the goal. Hmm?
Yeah.
Like, right now, I have this sense of lack. I'm not good enough. But when I become a professional baseball player or whatever, then I will have achieved what I'm looking for, and then everything will be okay. And the irony of that is this future orientation, which the ego is creating. We're constantly losing, overlooking, that is to say, something about the here and now, something that in some of the spiritual literature, they talk about the eternal now or the eternal present.
Hmm.
And you very nicely tied it to this other aspect of being in the zone. Because when we're in the zone, we're here and now. We're not caught up using this simply as something for the future. We're fully here and now. And the reason that happens is because we're able to let go and forget our sense of self, the anxious self that's trying to use this moment or use this situation or use our body to get
Hmm.
something out of it. We just sort of forget ourselves. We become the action, we become the activity. And then we're living in a kind of suspended present where we're fully right here and now rather than simply using the now as a means to something better in the future.
Yeah. I mean, just to get into myself, and, I would, what you said before, like I would get in the zone and then I would lose it. And then I would say, oh, I want to get back there.
Yeah.
I want to get back there. So here's the zone. And there's this Adam who wants
Right.
to get back in the
And you
zone,
can't do that.
and you can't do it.
Right.
And I've actually spoken a lot, a lot of athletes are getting more and more into meditation. And so um, a lot of athletes psychologically, because they're very aggressive oriented, they say, well, I'm going to get myself into the zone, I'm going to get myself into the zone. But really, can you talk about how could an athlete, in your opinion, use meditation practice to actually teach themselves really what they need to get into the zone and to sort of overcome this duality of me and the zone that I want to get to?
Right. Well, I think you've already pointed to, the important point there that if you think about it, this zone, sort of forgetting yourself, becoming the activity, it's not something that the self or the ego can do. In other words, it's the self or the ego disappearing. Well, guess what? You can't do that directly. It'd be like picking yourself, levitating by pulling on your shoestrings. I mean, it doesn't work that way. So the value of meditation, of course, is that when we're meditating, ultimately what's going on is we become immersed with the practice, whatever it may be. For example, a beginning meditation, very common in Buddhism, would be to count your breaths 1 to 10, 1 to 10, 1 to 10,
That's what I
in
do.
coordination with inhalation, exhalation. Yeah. Um, and the idea of doing that at the beginning, there's very much the sense that I'm doing it, and we have to make a real struggle because the mind tends to wander, right? So
Hmm.
we have to constantly come back and make that effort. And there's very much the sense of a self that is trying to do it and having a lot of trouble, especially at the beginning. But eventually, if we keep doing that, what happens, as I think you know, is we tend to sort of become one, sort of forget ourselves, lose ourselves, just become the counting. And there's less and less sense of an Adam or a David or a sense of self that's doing the counting. The counting kind of does itself. So you can say the sense of self is immersing itself in the activity, in the
Hmm.
flow of
Yeah.
the counting.
And
Now
what's it?
that so that applies to, it's like if we do that, then we're developing the ability to sort of forget ourselves
Yeah.
indirectly
Yeah.
simply by focusing on that. And then that's something that can carry over
Yeah.
in the athletics where we're, it doesn't mean that we will automatically find ourselves in the zone, but it makes it much more likely that we are able to do that when we're actually playing the
Yeah.
game.
And
Yeah.
I think one of the things I was going to mention is like doing the breath counting, which I've been doing, is that the last thing to get over is actually trying to accomplish something with it. Like, oh, I want to lose myself into the breath, because there's still a sense of a self trying to get there. And when that drops away, that's when you feel free, and it's kind of what you pointed to before, which I want to come back to at the end about playing, but I kind of wanted just to circle back to what you mentioned before about parental pressure and address that a little bit and where that comes from.
Mm.
Because when I grew up, I watched a lot of parents screaming at their kids on the baseball field. A lot of kids that I would see them up at bat. I remember this, and they would be up at bat and they'd be looking back at their dad all the time, looking back at their dad. Sometimes the dad would have to go and hide in the outfield because he realized the son was doing that. And I was like, "All right, let me go,
Mhm.
hide somewhere," or you know,
Mm.
um, the pressure. Oh, you got to get a college scholarship. You've got to make it. Um, the I saw a kid. I think he struck out at my nephew's game, and he was crying, and then the father started yelling at him, and they said, "Now we're going to go home, and I'm going to stick you in your room, or punish you." And there's so many of this element that goes on with sports, and I remember that for me, it stopped being fun. It stopped being a game. It stopped being something that I was enjoying. It became this thing that like I had to do and become. And I carried that with me the whole time, and talk about something that will prevent you from getting in the zone. That will,
Yeah,
all those
exactly.
assumptions and beliefs that get wired into the brain and got wired into my brain, that you can't play freely. So, what's going on here with this stuff? Talk a little bit about parental pressure, if you don't mind.
Well, what you brought out so well, I think, is the connection between what we have been saying in terms of, the sense of self, the inadequacy, the lack projects, and how that intersects with fraught family relationships, right? I mean, a
Yeah.
very important part of our lives has to do with our relationship to our parents. And, we want to be loved. We want to be, I mean, we want to be taken care of, but we definitely want their approval. That's just huge, especially when we're really, really young. And it's very sad that then the approval that we seek, which is to say the unconditional love of the parent, that somehow gets tied in to certain types of accomplishments on a sports field. And so it's kind of the unfortunate intersection of two sort of very problematical or somewhat fraught um, uh, issues. And then, of course, what happens, as you talked about, is how that becomes internalized. You know, it's not simply dad there in the stand, but you internalize that, and to the point often where dad may be gone, but even as we grow up, there's that concern for parental approval. But although I do think there's a broader issue here. I made the point earlier how the sense of self is a construct,
Right.
and not just a psychological construct, but very much a kind of a social one that we learn to see ourselves as other people do. And because of that, I think that explains a lot of why it is we're so preoccupied with what other people think about us. It's sort of built into the ego from the very beginning, and very much connected with the sense of lack or sense of inadequacy. I mean, when
Mm,
you think about the whole drive, I mean, we haven't really talked about it in much abstraction yet, but the idea of fame, uh, you know, and if you think about it, fame, what did Freud say? Fame is to be loved by, many anonymous people. Well, I'm not so sure about the love, but in the sense of to be known,
mhm.
and it gives us the sense of being more real. It's like when we're looking at, say, screens, we tend to see the same people, the same A-list Hollywood celebrities, or maybe politicians or sports heroes. And inevitably, there's a sense, well, they have some reality, right? Everyone knows them.
Mhm.
They are famous, they are successful. And compared to that, who knows me? I'm anonymous, right? I'm kind of nobody. But if I could be like them, then somehow the fame, being
Mhm.
uh, known and approved, and
Yep.
maybe people are transferring to me, then that's going to make me feel more real. It'll sort of fill up my
Right.
my my sense of lack.
Yeah, and you make the great points in the book too, about how we're running away. What you said about I don't want to be nobody, right? And the thing is, we're running away from being nobody, but nobody is actually what we are. So it's a this whole being real, or being, or all the stuff we're sort of driving at here,
Mm.
right? And with the point you make in the book is running away from I'm not real, or I'm not real in the way I think I
That's it.
am.
Or the
And
way that I think I should be.
or the way I
Yeah.
think I should be, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what you said too about, how I think you bring this up in the book too, some interesting things, which I don't know if we have time to get into, but I recommend everybody read the book, just about how existential guilt, right? This feeling of the guilt of being alive, and people looking, and like when people look at you, like why you feel embarrassed, or that all of these things that come upon us, like you really just delve into the book about, people just assume that they take these things for granted, like that they just are. And what's so great about the book is that you sort of lift you lift that up, and you look at what's underneath that, what's causing
Yeah.
all of this stuff,
Yeah.
what's really existentially there. um but I actually wanted to, I've got two more
Can I add
questions.
one more thing first
Yes,
here,
yeah, go
though,
ahead.
just to make sure we get it? Just,
Yeah.
just to emphasize this point again, that all of these lack projects, whether it's athletics or making money or becoming famous, I think it's really important to to really focus on the fact that they in themselves, they can't work. It's
Yeah.
like they can't give us what we're seeking from them. That they're just symptoms of the deeper problem. And then connecting that with the meditation, you see, because
Hmm.
for some people, meditation, in fact, maybe for all of us when we start out, that's another kind of lack project. I'm going to be special, or I'm going to be a Zen master, or or whatever. But the point of the meditation is it actually gives us a path, a process, a practice whereby we actually can forget ourselves. And if the sense of lack is the other side of the sense of self, when we forget the sense of self, we're
Hmm.
also forgetting the sense of lack. It's like that's what's behind what we were saying before about being in the zone, and forgetting yourself and being right here in the present. It's because the sense of self sort of dissipates or disappears in the activity, then the sense of lack is gone at the same time. So,
You know,
but but the other thing I want to emphasize, and maybe this is a little bit more Buddhist, so I don't want to spend
no,
too much
please,
time on
I'm
it.
all for it.
Okay, is ultimately in Buddhism, I mean, you can practice meditation in order to have more moments of being in the zone, such as we were talking about. But there are deeper possibilities in Buddhism. You know, we have this term enlightenment or
Right.
awakening. And the idea there is that it's possible for the sense of self to sort of let go and instead of experience ourselves in this usual dualistic way, I'm in here, somewhere in here, looking at you out there, the sense of self disappears and we realize that we're not separate from other people. We're not separate from the world, that we are. I mean, one way to say it is that I am, each of us is one of the ways the whole world is coming together right
Right.
here and now. So
No.
there is what Buddhism, for example, emphasizes is that it's possible to have this kind of experience where, as we say in Zen, we realize our true nature, and our true
Hmm.
nature isn't some ego or sense of separate self inside our heads or somewhere in
No.
here, but it's realizing that we're non-dual with the world. The Japanese Zen master Dogen expressed it so well. Let me just quote him.
Yes, please.
He said, "To to study the Buddha Dharma, to study in the sense of inquire into, right? To study the
Hmm.
Buddha Dharma is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. And that's what we're doing when we're meditating, you know. And then to forget yourself is to realize yourself as the 10,000 things, or to realize your non duality with the world.
Right.
And that, in a way, is the end of lack because, you know,
What are you lacking?
you don't need, yeah, there's no
There's
sense
nothing.
that there's no self that has to go anywhere, gain anything,
Well,
become anything.
yeah, I mean, I've listened, I've delved into this myself, so we can get into it. But it, from my perspective, right, when I view myself as a separate self, it makes sense to be anxious, to have lack, to whatever, because here's little old me. And then I've got the rest of the universe, which I'm not. And I've got all these people. And by the way, I'm very, very vulnerable. I can get sick. I can die. I can be poor. I mean, uh, just from a logical standpoint, a self is very, very vulnerable. So recognizing that these drives or these reactions come from it, and but there's another side of the coin to that, right, is all of the
Exactly.
suffering and all that stuff. And you know what you're kind of saying is, stay in my ways, but when you reckon, when you let go of this self, right, really actually in experience, and experientially realize that you're not this self, but you are that which wasn't born and wasn't and cannot die. Well, there's nowhere to go. There's really nothing I necessarily
There's
have to
freedom.
accomplish,
Yeah.
right? There's I don't have to protect myself anymore. I mean, obviously, if somebody comes after me with a knife, I'm probably still going to go like this.
Right.
I don't think we're talking about that.
Yeah.
It's there's a freedom there, where then actually paradoxically, I was going to get to this, is that I'm now free to do things in life and try to accomplish something, or to do the other do that which I actually was always maybe trying to do. But it's like, wow, now I'm freer, I'm more effective. It's like, yeah, you know, if I want to go and sing opera, or if I want to go practice law, or if I want to go this, I'm free to do that. But I know that it cannot possibly add anything to me. And if I lose something, it cannot possibly take anything away. And that's a very different shift, from the way we see things in Western culture. And then there's also the potential to, you know, when I look back at my baseball career, to bring it back into sports, I realized I was thinking about myself the whole time. I
Mm.
wasn't worried about my teammates. I wasn't thinking about what we as a team could do.
Mm.
You know, I wasn't really thinking about engaging with the people around me as much as I could have. And there's a whole other freedom in actually forgetting yourself. Forget make the major leagues, you know, throw that away. I want to be here with my teammates right now, and by the way, with the other team too, because I cannot compete in this game without them. I need the pitcher to be the batter. It's all, we're all doing this together. And so we can compete freely. And as you said, actually, in a chapter of your book, we can actually play and do these things, but it's like you're doing the same thing, but at the same time, it's completely different. So anyway, that's my perspective on sports. I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, well, going back to what you said about the what we have said about the sense of self, um, I think it's important to realize how much we need that sense of separate self too. It's like,
Mhm.
and even the future orientation to some degree, because I think that's built into us just by the nature of evolution.
Yep.
In order to survive and thrive, that way of perceiving the world of ourselves, uh, you know, you've got to think about how you're going to survive the winter if you don't have much food. You better plan ahead, and you know, thinking back in the old days before civilization, thinking of the Stone Age. So there's that dimension, that perspective, the more common one. That's important. The problem is we think that's the only one.
Yep.
Right? We're not aware that there's this other side to the coin. There's this other dimension, other perspective, such as we were talking about. This perspective where the sense of self, maybe temporarily evaporates, and we're experiencing non-dually. We're in the zone and so forth.
Mhm.
And the ultimate goal in something like Zen is not to kind of reject our normal reality, our normal way of understanding reality, but to sort of become aware of both sides and be comfortable being able to sort of move back and forth from one to the other according to the situation, and ultimately to integrate them.
Yeah.
So it's important. It's not just about sort of spacing out, but we
Mhm.
really need the normal way of experiencing reality. But the other thing I want to emphasize from what you said is how often, um, when we're caught up in these lack projects, um, inevitably we're self-preoccupied, right? We're
Mhm.
narcissistic to some degree. It's all about me because I have this sense of lack, and how am I going to fill it up? How am I going to resolve this problem? So that's where most of us start out, not just you on the baseball field, but all of us, especially in our very
Mhm.
individualistic culture. So
Yeah.
that's going to be there. But then the way we understand it in Zen, when we're able to forget ourselves and sort of realize our non-duality with the world, then there's a kind of a shift possible in the meaning of our lives, away from what's in it for me, to wow, it's just okay. I'm not motivated by lack project. I don't need to become anyone.
Mhm.
I see through the delusion of separation. And what we emphasize is kind of a natural shift in the meaning of one's life, away from self preoccupation to sort of, well, there are some issues here, especially now. There's some problems. There's a lot of suffering in the world. Well, hey, given who I am, given my situation, I wonder what I can do to make this a better world for all of us.
Mhm.
So I think that that's an important side of it. And it's not so much that we're motivated by a sense of guilt, or oh God, now I've got to do this, but it's more something we're naturally motivated, freely motivated, because we don't feel separate from other people, and we don't feel separate from their problems, and we realize that our own well-being, guess what, isn't separate from the well-being of other people, isn't separate from the well-being of the earth, for that matter, as
Yeah.
we're well aware these days.
Yeah. I mean, I amazing points you make. Do you have time for one more point?
Sure,
That
sure.
sure. So I kind of wanted to bring this home and actually make it personal, and because one thing I realized at a young age when I made it to the Yankees at 18 years old, and I was happy for 30 seconds, and then I was like, well, oh, now I'm worried about how I'm going to play, and I'm miserable again. And then I tried to become an opera singer, and I um, I just wanted it, so badly. And chasing these dreams of what I could become. And ultimately, I actually made some mistakes with my voice at the time, kind of because I was overreaching myself, trying to be something that I wasn't,
Pushing yourself.
trying to be like trying to be like Pavarotti when actually I'm a baritone.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lower voice.
Hmm.
And then something really strange happened in the sense that I became a lawyer because I was told by a girl I was dating before I became a lawyer, like, "Oh, Adam, you've accomplished so much, but you haven't established yourself yet." So I said, "Oh, well, what's the thing I can do? I got to make money now and do all this stuff." And I was like, "Well, I can't do what I like anymore. I've got to become a lawyer, and I got to make money, and I've got to, you know, be some big
Mm.
shot lawyer." And I did it. I was working in a big law firm in New York City, and I remember 3 years in, I'm sitting there at my desk, and all of a sudden it hits me. I'm going to sit here for the rest of my life, and then I'm going to die.
Mm.
Like, it hit me like a ton of bricks. It was like, this is it? Like, I've gotten here and this is it?
Mm.
And I was faced with such a dread that I didn't want to look at the time. And what I did was, well, I got to go back and sing opera because that's what I love to do. And I
Mm.
went back to do that. And then COVID hit. And
Mm.
then uh then opera for that time went out the window.
Mm.
And by this time I was at another law firm, and I actually took a step back in my job there. I said, I don't want to work, 80 hours, 100 hours a week anymore. I'm taking a step back. And so I did that for a few years. And one of the things that I always thought about in my head was the reason why in that moment when I'm sitting at their law firm saying, I'm going to sit here for the rest of my life and then I'm going to die, was this feeling of having the next project always distracted me in my life from the fact that I'm going to die. See,
Mm.
if I have the next project, if I've got the next goal, if I've got the next fantasy that I can accomplish, it maintains my optionality in a sort of Peter Pan like way. Like
Mm.
I can hang on to my youth. When we're kids, we have all these options and we can do everything we want. Or, and then it was like I didn't want to let that go. And I knew, and I said, is that what's going on here? Is it really that I don't like being a lawyer, or is it that I just don't want to say, like, no, this is life. I'm going to do this and then I'm going to die. Like, this is reality. And I don't want to look. I don't want to look. I'm too scared. I need a project. And what ended up happening to me is I actually went, talk about forgetting yourself. I've been practicing Zen for very intensely for the last 2 years,
Mm.
still keeping my sort of pared down law job,
Mhm.
and saying, I don't like being a lawyer. I don't like being a lawyer. And I went to a session for the first time. I think I told you before, a week ago. And something happened while I was sitting there in excruciating pain. And I, all of a sudden, it was like, I don't know when it happened, but it was like, you know what? It was like almost like I don't have to fantasize anymore. I can look at reality as it
Mm.
is. And I came back home and I called my law firm up and I said, you know what? Promote me again. I think I told you that last week that I'd gotten a promotion.
Mhm.
And I went, I said, you know what? I'm gonna the way it's not that I don't like it, but the way is the way through it, to engage it. Talk about integrating, to engage it. And this divide between I don't like this, I like this, I don't want to do this, I want to do that,
Mhm. Mhm.
that divide is art. It's not really real. And finally, I was able to look at my life and just say, you know what? I'm a dad, I'm a father, I'm a lawyer. This is it. That's okay. That's okay. I'm going to die. It's okay. I'm okay. I still love to sing. I'm going to sing, but I don't have to become a famous opera singer. You know, I love doing this podcast. I love talking to you. It doesn't have to become famous, but I'm going to try my best. I'm going to try my best and give my all, whether I'm sitting on the cushion or doing whatever I'm doing. And bringing this back into athletics, and the reason why I'm telling this story is like, I think myself, I'll talk about myself and maybe not project onto a lot of people, but using these things to either distract ourselves from our mortality or distract ourselves from our limitations or trying to become an ideal. And then the pressure internally that I put on myself to do it, which was all unnecessary. And, you know, my experience is like, there's another way to go here. And so I kind of wanted to tell you that story because it had such an impact on me.
Hmm.
And it was really, I think, the fruition of reading your book and really reading your book and really seeing, like, because it's possible to read a book and have it be a conceptual thing, but then to read a book like your book and to really look at myself, use it as as almost like a koan, and use it to penetrate myself. And anyway, I want to thank you for that, for reading the book, for writing that book, and for giving this, person the opportunity to uh, uh, really look at myself in a very deep way. And I really appreciate it very, very, very much. So that was the last thing I was going to say, and I was going to open it to you to respond to what I said in any way, because, and then to bring it back to sports too, just to be able to play just the game as it is,
Yeah.
and you could even try to get better and improve and go to your coach, and do this stuff. And um but it would be different. Like there's a play there. There's a seriousness and a play there. So anyway,
Playfulness.
I playfulness. I leave it up to you, David, to comment on that. But I just had to tell you that story.
Oh,
So
thank you for that story, Adam. Wow, wow. And frankly, I think you've said it better than I can, which doesn't mean I'm not going to try to say something about it. But
please,
but but uh, you know how, I mean, I think you're right at the point. It's not as though, like, say I'm not an athlete, but I write books, and among other things. But so, and I can see writing a book can be a lack project too, right? Well, Buddhism philosophy books probably not going to become rich, but maybe if enough people read it, a little bit famous in that little narrow world, whatever. So writing a book, like anything else, can become a lack project, but it's not to say that you can't write a book without it being a lack project. It's like, uh, what's often the case, I think, is that our motivations are not just simple and pure, but there's a lot of different things going on. And what I loved about what you said is, I think you expressed it so well, that it doesn't mean that we have to give up writing books or becoming a lawyer or becoming an opera singer, but it has to do with the motivation, and it's often unconscious that we're driven in a certain kind of way to try to use that in order to get to a certain kind of place. And if we can let go of that and just sort of be here doing it here and now, then there's a real sense of completeness. And of course, very different way of experiencing time when, we're not always sacrificing here and now for the kind of person that we're going to be in the future. So, I mean, what what's delightful hearing, what really means a lot to me to hear what you say is that I think you understood the book. And, that's not something that anyone can ever take for granted, especially that kind of a book.
Yeah.
And the fact that you were able to read it and then go on a session, I think that was a nice combination. So, yeah, thank you.
Well, yeah. Well, David, thank you for so much for this conversation. I had so much fun. And I hope the people that
Me too.
listen enjoy it as much as I did. So thank you very much.
Can I just add briefly,
Yes.
again, putting in the plug,
Go ahead.
if there's if people were interested in this conversation and want to follow up, there's the book, of course, but there's also my website. There's a lot of other stuff,
Yeah.
articles,
Well,
podcasts, videos,
when I
etc.
post
So,
it, I'll
okay,
link to your books on Amazon and your website and everything.
great.
So
Okay, good.
I've
Just a
already
way to follow
recommended your book, and I know at least one person has bought it because I said you got to read this book. So
up.
um
Thanks for the
I
plug. Like I said, I'll send you that money by PayPal.
all right, David, thank you so much.
Take care, Adam. Thank
Bye.
you.